right, thank you very much for attending my session today on beneficial electrification and customer expectations. My name is Patty Durand. I'm the president and CEO of the Smart Energy Consumer Collaborative, and I'm thrilled to say that we are celebrating 10 years as an organization this year. So it's been a great decade. We've seen a lot of changes in the last 10 years, from how customers engage around energy and technology, and we're poised to have another amazing decade of major changes in how customers will engage with electricity and technology. And we'll go through some of that today. But before we get to that, let me tell you a little bit more about my organization. This is a snapshot of who we are. We have about 170 members, but this is just a nice visual depiction of membership across the continent. And in terms of what we do, we're a nonprofit and we have three main goals as part of our mission. The first goal is to listen to consumers directly through focus groups, through surveys, through on-camera interviews, but to actually talk to consumers about their concerns and thoughts around energy and technology. And the other main program we do is educate. We educate both consumers directly through social media, through a website called whatissmartenergy.org, and through educational pieces like YouTube videos and fact sheets and blogs. But we also educate stakeholders, energy professionals such as yourselves attending this Bidgely Virtual Conference, trying to learn more about everything to do with the energy stakeholder community. We educate stakeholders through also social media, different platforms, and we educate them through webinars and through conference presentations and events. And then the last big piece we do is collaborate, and that's in our name. It's a very important part of our work. We collaborate by bringing people together at our own events and on our committees, and again in our webinars. And when I say collaboration, I mean that we have many different types of members, all with different views of electricity. So we have consumer advocates, we have tech companies like Bidgely, service providers, we have utilities, probably about half of our members are utilities, and they all come to the table with a different view and different outlook around consumers. And so when I say collaboration, we're probably the only or one of the few nonprofits that actually brings together all those viewpoints at the table to discuss how to engage and educate and empower consumers around energy and technology. So that's a quick snapshot of what we do. And then now I'd like to show you some of our recent consumer research so that you can get an understanding of the different studies that we've done and the different knowledge base that exists out there around consumers. There was a lot of work around understanding data analytics and its future impact on the grid. And the piece we did was, what are consumer pain points and how can data solve them? We did one on customer platform of the future. So what kind of marketplaces do consumers want? Do they want their utility to sell them things? Do they want just products, or do they want products and services too? Things like that. We've done many low-income studies. I think we're getting ready to do our fourth one. We'll be ready to publish that later in the year in Q4. And then we did a deep dive on rate design, because there's over half of US households now have an AMI deployment or a smart meter. So new types of rates are a possibility that have never been possible before. So what do consumers want? Would they enroll in a time of use rate plan? What about critical peak rebates or peak time pricing? What are their views and understanding of all those different kinds of rate plans? So we took a deep dive on that. And then this one is the only segmentation framework that I know of for small, medium business customers. So they're often a neglected group of customers. We took their attitudes and values over a very long-term survey, very deep dive in the different types of small, medium businesses out there. And then we divided them into different sets of attitudes or values around energy and technology and what they want from their utility, what kind of services and products do they want. And each of those 5 tiles you see on the cover there represents a different set of attitudes or values that they have. So if you work with SMB customers, that's a really good study for you to get your hands on. So that's what we've done in the past. And what I'd like to show you today, and what we'll talk about, is our beneficial electrification study, with the goal being to understand consumer interest in transitioning to electricity from other non-electric fuels, so gas, natural gas, gasoline, other fossil fuel sources. And what we wanted to do is understand more about their attitudes and their values, and sometimes referred to as fuel switching. There's a lot of different terms, like there's electrify everything, there's beneficial electrification. So we wanted to get our hands on what this concept was and what do consumers think about it, since they'll be playing a major role in it happening or not happening, as the case may be. So we did it in 2 phases. We started with an industry scan white paper where we talked to experts in the industry who know a lot about electrification. We wanted to interview them and learn about what they perceive as the barriers or the policy needs or the pace of change. What's going to happen, and what would they want to know from consumers if they could ask consumers anything they wanted. And so we took those findings and put it into the quantitative study, the online survey with 1,200 customers. That's what I'll be presenting the findings from today. And that study has a 95% confidence interval with a 3% margin of error. When you have that many survey takers, you can get pretty close to facts in terms of what do consumers know and what do they want and what are their views. But before I do that, I do want to just do a refresh on our segmentation framework. We also have a residential framework, also in addition to the small medium business one I just mentioned. We do this one a lot more often. So I think the last time we did it was in 2019, where we identified 4 main sets of values called segments that consumers have around energy. And this graphic is a nice visual depiction of how people fall on the spectrum of being favorable toward energy and technology. It's on their mind. They don't have very many barriers. They might think it's kind of cool and they can afford some things, or they feel like electricity is really critical to everything they do. Then there's the energy indifferent, the people who don't care about electricity, who don't think about it. It's not a priority, and they're probably not going to engage around anything to do with technology or programs. And there's the movable middle, which is the largest cohort of customers, and they're the ones who would engage if it's made easy enough for them, or if they're incented in some way, but otherwise they're pretty passive. So that's just a nice high-level overview of the different attitudes they have on a big picture spectrum. And what I'd like to show you here is a deeper dive on who they are in terms of percentage of the US population, age, and income demographics, and their average bill size. And it's important to note that when it comes to average bill size, the tech-savvy proteges tend to have the highest bills, and they tend to be the most interested in technology, not only to save them money, although they name that as a major reason, but because they just like technology. They're the early adopters. They tend to be male, and they can afford the technology, and they just like it. So it's fun to them. And then there's the green innovators, the consumers that care a lot about sustainability and climate change. The movable middle, I mentioned already, tend to be apathetic, but will engage with the right incentive or the right messaging. And then there's the energy indifferent, and you can see their bill is the lowest. They are a little bit older than other segments, and they can afford their bill, so they're not likely to engage at all on energy. But if you take the other 3 segments together and add them up, you'll see they represent the vast majority of US consumers. And so they would be interested in hearing from their utility or hearing from a tech company in terms of what's available for them. And now I'm going to transition to beneficial electrification. And this graphic is a little bit misleading. I'll just disclose to you that it is. So This is accurate in the sense that the grid's carbon emissions have been going down since 2005 fairly precipitously. In part, it's due to the transition from coal to natural gas, and in part, it's due to increasing renewable energy penetration on the grid. But it's misleading in that it implies that carbon emissions are going down overall in the US, and they're not. Carbon emissions are either steady or going up, depending on when you start the year that you start looking at it. This is just from the grid. There are other sources of emissions like vehicles, manufacturing, and things like that. But this is a really good graphic in that it explains why beneficial electrification is even happening. And let me just clarify that worldwide carbon emissions are going up very fast, and so the news is not good. But in terms of electrification, it is a clear path forward in addressing climate change and its impacts on the planet. And so let's talk a little bit about what makes electrification beneficial. So RAP is a very credible research organization. They've been around a long time and they work with regulatory commissions across the US. The Regulatory Assistance Project has 3 conditions that they have identified that makes it beneficial. So first, if the transition from gas, liquid gas or natural gas to electricity has to happen, it needs to save money. Customers should not and cannot switch if it's going to cost them more. Second, it has to reduce environmental impacts. It could be carbon. It could also be other dirty sources of emission like air pollution or heavy use of water or water pollution. Electricity production uses a tremendous amount of water and it returns hot water into the river or water source that it draws from. So there needs to be some improvement in environmental impacts. And then last, it needs to have better grid flexibility. With electrification, there is a lot greater opportunity for demand response, distributed energy resources, being able to shift load, like, for example, electric hot water heaters in some states are a huge source of load shifting when they need to be and have very little impact on consumers because water's already hot in the tank. It doesn't matter when the tank heats the water as long as there's hot water when the consumer wants it, but it matters a lot to a grid operator, for example. So there's a whole report on this, but that's just a quick snapshot of what makes it beneficial. And the previous graphic on the reduction in carbon emissions is the reason for the shift happening at all. Now, the rest of my research is going to cover what consumers think about beneficial electrification, but I urge you to read RAP's report on beneficial electrification if you'd like to learn more about grid impacts, what flexibility means when it comes to beneficial electrification, and things related to environmental pollution and saving money. But what we focus on is consumers and consumer engagement. So let me tell you just a little bit about consumer motivations around electrification. So we ask them questions like, is it important to you as a consumer for the grid to electrify liquid and natural gases if it has benefits to you? And if it's important, who should do the electrification? And if it's important, what are some of the reasons? So you can see here in this graphic that when it comes to reasons for electrification, we've provided them a whole host of reasons, including none of those. So things like extreme weather events, outdoor air pollution, sea level rise, and whatever we could come up with as the most likely reasons for why electrification should happen. And we put it in order, we put the answers here in order of highest to lowest in terms of most to least. So top of the graphic is extreme weather events causing loss of life or destruction of property is the top reason consumers think that electrification should proceed. And then you can look on the right side, the gray bar chart, which shows why consumers don't think something is as important. And to my surprise, fourth from the bottom is sea level rise threatening coastal areas. That one ranked pretty low in terms of consumer concern. And I mean, I personally find that to be extremely horrifying to think of Miami and New Orleans and New York, those cities being at risk. and islands, but that has not hit the, I guess, the consciousness of enough consumers yet that ranks very high. But they have experienced a lot of extreme weather events. So that one's coming in first in terms of the reasons why they care about this. And then we also ask them questions around electrification. What are your views around electric vehicles, around public transport? Should they be electric? Should they be gas? Do you care at all? What about municipal fleets? And what about school buses? And we ask them questions about infrastructure. Who should pay for what? And so you can see on this graphic, on the middle one, the darker blue, the electric infrastructure should be paid for by the electric utility. And on the right side, the lighter blue, it should be paid for by government. And so you can see when it comes to electric vehicle charging stations, it's pretty evenly split. Consumers don't really care who pays for it. They just think that someone should pay for it. When it comes to electric public transportation and investing in municipal vehicles, there's some slight differences, but they're really within the margin of error. The point I want you to have is that there's very high interest in both, over 60% or right at 60 for those things to be electrified. And then when it comes to cost increases, we ask them if it's 10% higher for you to make that switch, are you still interested in switching? A third of consumers said they are, even if it's higher. And then you'll see some lower numbers here in terms of not being willing to pay more. We also ask them questions about, would you electrify at home? Would you switch your natural gas to an electric stove? What about an electric lawnmower and water heater? And consumers showed broad interest in those things. You can see here a graphic based on different segmentations with very high levels from all segments, well over 50% as showing interest. So these are really good, strong numbers showing consumers do care about these topics and are willing to make the switch. And then we also ask them about barriers. What about if it's a lot more expensive? What if it's not as efficient? Generally, consumers were very open to all of these ways to switch, with only cost being the real barrier. And then we were also asked to test a lot around climate change. What do consumers know about climate change? The reason to even electrify at all, the reason we're even having this conversation is because of carbon emissions. Without carbon being an issue, there is no need to electrify. And so we were asked by our members to find out what messages matter the most to consumers. But what we found was one key message, and this is it, number one: electricity is becoming cleaner and more renewable every day, was the top message that resonated with all 4 of our consumer segments. If a stakeholder says that, that is very impactful to consumers. They will respond to that. They care a lot about that fact, and that is very important to them. And then I want to end with an invitation for you to join us on social media. We have a very robust set of findings that we put on LinkedIn and put out on Twitter. We have almost 10,000 followers. We have a lot of key research components that we put on LinkedIn because you can just say a lot on LinkedIn. So you would search Smart Energy Consumer Collaborative on LinkedIn and join us in the conversation online. And I just want to thank you again for attending this session, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.